Okay, I want to continue with my discussion of Hegel. Last time I talked about how Hegel is reacting against Kant. And I think the main thing that you need to know about Hegel and Kant is you can represent it in terms of a picture. The Kantian view can represent this way over here with a horizontal line, which represents Kant's breaking the world up into two parts: the world of phenomena, the world that we experience through our five senses, and the world of the noumena, the world that transcends our senses. Kant experience, so the world of noumena, Kant says, is what we have no experience of and of which we can never have any knowledge of. For, for Kant, all knowledge is down here. So, for example, science for Kant can only tell us about the world of phenomena, the world as it appears to us. If you remember at the end of The Future of an Illusion, Freud brought that up, and Freud's brought that up as an objection, as one objection to his view that science tells us about reality. And Freud considered the objection, that some people say it only tells us about the world as it appears to us. Freud's answer to that was, so what? That's all we care about. All we really care about is the world as it appears to us. So Freud had no problems with that. Anyway, this idea that science only tells us about the world as it appears to us comes from Immanuel Kant, at least in the Western tradition. So the world of noumena, for example, Kant puts God up here, free will, and the soul. So Kant would argue that we have no knowledge. We can have no knowledge of God. We can't have any knowledge of the soul. And we can't have any knowledge of free will. And yet Kant did believe that they existed, but he believed that we couldn't prove it. And the way he does it is by saying that they are the conditions of the possibility of our very experience itself. But anyway, I don't want to talk about that right now. I want to talk about his main vision of the world is split into two, and there's a wall here that you cannot bridge. This is very different from Plato. It's like Plato and different from Plato. Plato also split the world into two: the world inside the cave and the world outside the cave, the world of sense perception and the world of the eternal forms, where you have the mathematical truths, where you have justice and courage and love, beauty, good. The form of the good for Kant is the highest. For Plato, though, you could bridge the gap. The soul, the thinker, our mind, for Plato, is able to know what's up here. For Kant, there's no way to bridge this gap. We can have absolutely no knowledge of what's up here. That's fundamental to Kant. Hegel rejects the whole thing. Just like Aristotle rejected the forms, Hegel is going to reject Kant's picture of the world as split into two. So instead of seeing it as drawing a line and having phenomena here below and the noumena up here, I drew a circle. And this is so, if you want to picture Hegel, just think of a circle. It's one. Spinoza is in the tradition of Parmenides and Spinoza. In fact, he said, any philosophy has to begin with Spinoza. Spinoza's insight that all is one. And this goes ultimately back to Parmenides. All is one. This division between phenomena and noumena, Hegel says, is an error. It's wrong. And I'm going to talk a little about what Hegel says at the beginning of the Phenomenology of the Spirit, where he talks about Kant's assumption that knowledge can be seen as an instrument or as a medium through which the absolute comes to us. And Hegel thinks it's totally wrong. But anyway, for Hegel, reality is one. It's spiritual, or mental. He calls it Geist, which can be translated as mind or spirit. You can think of it as God in Spinoza's sense of the word, Deus sive natura, God or nature. Reality is one, and we are part of it. That's the Hegelian perspective. Hegel is an absolute idealist, so ultimately for Hegel, everything ultimately comes from consciousness. The difference between Hegel and every other previous philosopher, especially, think of Plato, for example. Plato's forms what's ultimately real for Plato are the forms, which are not mental, they're immaterial. So that Plato himself is an idealist, meaning that ultimate reality is not material. Plato hated Democritus, for example. I don't think he even mentions his name. Democritus is a guy, the Greek, that believed in that the ultimate constituents of reality were these tiny indivisible atoms. Okay, which nowadays philosophers science talks about atoms. But for Heraclitus, these atoms were material and indivisible. We now know that atoms are not material and they are divisible. But anyway, that was Democritus's view, that ultimate reality was material. Plato goes against it 100%. Plato is an idealist. What's ultimately real are these eternal forms. They are timeless, eternal, unchanging. Hegel's view is very different. It's the opposite, you might say, of Plato's view of ultimate reality as being timeless, changeless, and eternal. For Hegel, reality is constantly changing. The absolute, God, right? Call it God, call it the absolute, Geist, mind, spirit, is ultimate reality of which we are part of. Our minds are part of God's mind. For Hegel, though, this absolute, call it God or Geist, is not timeless and not eternal. Geist is constantly changing. Because for Hegel, Geist, even though it's the absolute, it doesn't know itself as the absolute. So it has to, in a sense, undergo this cosmic education. And that's the Hegelian dialectic. And human history is the way in which it actually undergoes that dialectic. So for Hegel, the history of philosophical thought, from Plato, well, actually from Thales to the Greek philosophers, Pythagoras, Parmenides, to Socrates, to Plato, to Aristotle, to Augustine, to Aquinas, to Descartes, to Locke, to Hume, to John Stuart Mill, to Hegel, all these people, Wittgenstein, Heidegger, are ways in which the absolute one, God, is coming to understand himself. So think of like a human being, right? You start out as a little baby, you're 1 week old, 2 weeks old, you know nothing about the world, and you start learning, right? And gradually you start acquiring experience, and eventually, you start learning more things, and eventually you might grow up into a great philosopher like Hegel, right? Or Kant. But even Hegel and Kant started out as little babies. They had to go through this process, this dialectical process of constant change and conflict. They had to learn things. When Hegel was 4 years old, believe me, he did not know his mature philosophy. He had to learn it. It's not like, well, too bad when he was 4 years old, we couldn't just go. He was making mistakes back then. No, Hegel would say, no, when you're 4 and 5 years old, you think as a 4 and 5 year old. You have no choice. You can't just say, well, it was all wrong. No, yeah, it was. When you're 6 years, 7 years old, yeah, what you're thinking is wrong from a perspective of when you're 40 years old, but that's the best you can do when you're 4 years old. So there's no way to avoid it. Hegel's view is similar to that when it comes to history of philosophy. The mistakes that philosophers make, they are necessary mistakes. They are steps along the way in which Geist is coming to understand itself. They are necessary steps. They cannot be avoided. So for Hegel actually created the history of philosophy. Before Hegel, there was no history of philosophy. I mean, sure, people knew that there were different philosophers, but they were just like isolated individuals. There was no connection between them. There's no historical, nothing that tied them together. For Hegel said, no, Hegel actually created the history of philosophy. Now, you can go to the bookstore and buy books on the history of philosophy. Hegel created that discipline. Because for Hegel, the history of philosophy is not simply something, you add on to it. It's like you can ignore it. No, you can't just go back and read Aristotle or Plato and take them as isolated individuals and say, he got it right. No, they all got it right. And they all got it wrong. You have to understand, you need to understand what's going on. You need to take the whole thing and the whole sweep of it. And then you see how mind, Geist, is coming to know itself. Anyway, Hegel led to, Karl Marx took this idea of development, historical development. He took it over and he turned Hegel upside down, as he said, and he interpreted it materialistically. But I want to, in the remaining few minutes of this, I want to go over Hegel's critique of Kant's view that knowledge is an instrument. So you have cognition, you have the knowing subject here, the knowing subject, the knower, and the known. He calls it the absolute. I'll call it the absolute. The knower, the known. Kant. Here's what Hegel says at the beginning of phenomenology. It is a natural assumption that in philosophy, before we start to deal with the proper subject matter, namely the actual cognition of what truly is. I mean, that's what philosophy and science are all about. You want to know what truly is, the known. You want to know reality. That it is a natural assumption, and this goes back to Locke, that in philosophy, before we start to deal with what, the object of knowledge, we need, one must first of all come to an understanding about cognition, which is regarded as an instrument to get hold of the absolute or the medium through which we discover it. This is Locke. Locke says, before we start talking about these metaphysical systems, about ultimate reality, we need to examine reason itself, cognition, to see what it is capable of, what it is not capable of. Hegel says that people like Locke and Kant assume that you have the knower is separated from the knower, the known. That's an assumption. Our knowledge, cognition, is conceived of as an instrument by which we grasp the object. And that's an assumption. Hegel says that it's common to all previous philosophers. Knowledge is seen as something by which we grasp. In fact, we even talk about we grasp an idea. Hegel rejects that. Hegel says, if you think of knowledge as an instrument by which you grasp the object of knowledge, you're never going to grasp the object. You're only going to grasp the object as it has been distorted by the instrument. Because for Hegel, anytime you apply an instrument to an object, you distort that object. Think of if you have a hammer and you're trying to straighten something out. Well, when a hammer hits the object that's hitting, it's changing the object. It's putting a dent in it. Any instrument, when you grasp something with an instrument, you're changing the object of what you're grasping in some way. Quantum physicists found out when they look at when you shine a light, for example, on a subatomic particle, the very act of shining a light on it or observing the particle already interferes with it, because by shining a light beam on a subatomic particle will change that particle, will change the motion of that particle, the velocity, and so on. So the very act of observation distorts what you're observing. You can never observe what's actually there because the very act of observation changes it. Hegel says when Kant is assuming, not only Kant but Locke and other people, but he's focused on Kant, is assuming that cognition or knowledge is an instrument. And he says that's an assumption that has to be questioned. You say, well, the idea is that before we can examine whether knowledge is telling us anything about the object, we need to examine the instrument. Hegel says if you're assuming that knowledge is an instrument, and Hegel rejects that. And he also rejects the idea that knowledge is a medium through which the object comes to us. We passively receive it through a medium. I'm going to talk about that in my next little lecture. But in this one, I want to focus on the fact that Hegel rejects the idea that knowledge, cognition, is an instrument by which we grasp the object or the absolute or reality. Actually, for Hegel, it's part of reality.